Tonight on Nova.
As I was running down the beach, I noticed material glinting between high and low water in the early morning sun. I realized that I was running in human excrement, that the beach from high to low water for miles down there were covered with raw sewage.
Over the past 20 years, in the Northern Hemisphere, there has developed what I call the Cousteau mystique. The oceans are sacrosanct. I argue even hazardous waste can be put into the oceans without an unacceptable impact if you put them far enough out.
Will we find solutions in time to save a natural resource vital to our survival? Are you swimming in a sewer?
Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. Additional funding was provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And by Allied Signal, a technology leader in aerospace, electronics, automotive products, and engineered materials.
This is the end of the line for sewage and wastewater from thousands of homes and industries in the greater Boston metropolitan area. 50 feet beneath the surface of Boston Harbor at the end of a 60-inch pipe, we're looking at one of the reasons Boston Harbor is in trouble. Every day in this country, billions of gallons of wastewater are discharged into the marine environment. Boston alone pumps out 500 million gallons a day. Los Angeles, 950 million gallons daily. And New York generates a staggering 1.5 billion gallons of wastewater every single day. This daily dose of pollution includes bacteria and viruses carried in human feces, thousands of toxic chemicals, and a tremendous volume of organic matter that has the potential to disrupt coastal ecosystems. From homes, businesses, and factories, waste is flushed and poured into municipal sewer systems with hardly a second thought. The assumption is someone else will take care of that which we don't want. But is this a reasonable or safe assumption? How dangerous is the waste we pour into the sea? What do we know about its impact on marine ecosystems and humankind? Is using the oceans as our waste bucket a disposal strategy with a future? Or is it just a short-sighted solution to an immediate problem? One that guarantees our coasts will forever be washed by troubled waters.
The most deadly pollution in Puget Sound is concentrated in the bays of its major cities. Some harbors have sediments so loaded with toxic chemicals that their cleanup is thought near impossible. Best known are Tacoma's Commencement Bay, Seattle's Elliott.
For TV news watchers in coastal communities, reports about marine pollution problems are all too familiar.
They borrow from the well-worn poem, roses are red, violets are blue, when sea life vanishes, so will you. Doug Schimel, 3 Eyewitness News.
Almost 15 years after passage of the Federal Clean Water Act, we continue to pollute coastal environments with domestic and industrial waste.
Tests by the group have turned up hazardous chemicals here, including metals, acids, and cyanide. 5 other companies dump unknown chemicals here without proper permits. That is a violation of state law.
With a growing population producing ever-increasing volumes of waste, the future of our coasts remains threatened.
And so while charges and countercharges continue over who's doing and not doing what to clean up Santa Monica Bay, the public is left to wait and wonder just what risk it's been taking over the years eating fish from these waters. Mary Miller, News 13, Santa Monica.
In 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, directing the federal government to control the discharge of waste into the coastal environment. The act called for increased treatment of municipal and industrial wastewater. It banned, in most cases, the dumping of solid waste at sea. Yet today, nearly 15 years later, the waters along our coasts are still far from clean. Because of the high costs involved, many municipalities and industries have resisted complying with the act. Often, this has let a bad situation get worse. This is Boston, Massachusetts. Like many coastal cities, Boston has rediscovered the appeal of living, working, and playing near the sea. $3 billion of new investment is changing the face of Boston's waterfront, while city and state officials are planning a new harbor park. Yet the harbor itself remains one of the most polluted in the country. Bill Golden grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts, a Boston suburb located on the harbor's southern shore. Over the years, he has watched the steady deterioration of the harbor. 3 years ago, while serving as Quincy City Attorney, he was moved to begin a personal crusade to turn things around.
One summer morning in 1982, I was running along the beach about sunrise. And as I was running down the beach, I noticed material glinting between high and low water in the early morning sun. And at first I thought these were jellyfish that had washed up between high and low water. As I ran down the beach, I realized that I was running in human excrement, that the beach from high to low water for miles down there were covered with raw sewage. Now this was on a hot summer's day in which in a few hours I knew there'd be young children swimming in this water, surrounded by this filth. And to see this beautiful resource, see this bay that had been so important to me as a young boy, turned into an open sewer, was absolutely more than I could take as an elected official.
On behalf of the city of Quincy, Golden sued Boston and the area's Regional Sewer Commission. His lawsuit focused public attention as never before on the use of the harbor as a waste receptacle. From millions of toilets, sinks, showers, and washing machines, a daily torrent of residential waste flows toward Boston Harbor. It starts in household sewer pipes, moves on to street mains, and then to ever larger trunk lines. Along the way, thousands of businesses and factories add commercial and industrial waste. Through a vast network of underground arteries that stretches all the way from Framingham, 25 miles to the west, sewage makes its way toward either of two regional treatment plants, both located on harbor islands. All too often, some of this sewage never gets to the plants. Almost every rainfall pours more water into the sewers than the plants can handle. When this happens, raw, untreated sewage flows directly into the harbor. Here, raw sewage is flowing from a pipe located beneath the New England Aquarium, one of Boston's major tourist attractions. The system does a little better with the sewage that gets to the treatment plants, but not much. Greater Boston's wastewater plants can only provide the most basic level of treatment, and even this is often not achieved since the plants are old, chronically understaffed, and in poor repair. In fact, the Smithsonian Institute has already asked for one of the system's antique pumps, if it's ever taken out of service. After treatment, metropolitan Boston's sewage, now in the form of a chlorinated liquid and a slightly thicker sludge, is discharged through underwater pipes directly into the harbor.
Boston Harbor today, I think, is in deplorable state. It is one of the nation's greatest natural resources, and yet has become the dumping ground for some 2 million people living throughout the metropolitan district system, encompassing some 43 communities and towns. It receives a massive and unlawful, and I would submit unconscionable, daily dose of pollution. It receives nearly 500 billion gallons of effluent per day, which receives rudimentary treatment at best. It gets 500,000 gallons of raw sludge per day, 5.7 billion gallons of untreated refuse per year. So there's a massive dose of pollution, much of it of a toxic nature. Those are numbers that are hard for me and hard for most people to grasp, but in graphic terms, if one were to plug the pipes going into the harbor today, a year from now, the 50 square miles of the city of Boston would be nearly 17 feet deep in effluent. The 500 square miles of the MDC cities and towns, 43 communities, would be nearly 2 feet deep. One would need hip boots to wade around in Framingham.
The effects of all this sewage are widespread. Every summer, beaches in the harbor are closed, some for as many as 25 days. One-third of the area's 4,000 acres of clam flats are closed indefinitely, and most of the rest are restricted to bonded master clammers who have to take their catch to a state-run purification facility. And now, concern is growing about fish caught in the harbor. Recent studies have found unusually high rates of cancer and disease in some of the harbor's most abundant species. Under intensifying pressure from the federal government, the courts, and public opinion, local authorities are finally preparing to take action. The state has announced plans to replace this antiquated treatment plant on Deer Island with a new, more efficient facility. Sludge dumping in the harbor will be stopped. Repairs to the sewer system will be made. This will cost over $1 billion and take more than 10 years. It will not solve all of the harbor's problems. Boston Harbor may someday be as clean as the cleanest urban harbors today, but here and elsewhere, that's probably not clean enough. Municipal sewage like this contains 3 sources of problems. The first are nutrients and organic matter from human feces and decaying food. This leads to oxygen depletion in the water, which can result in disease and even death for fish and other marine animals. The second source of concern in sewage is disease-carrying bacteria and viruses. Bacteria like these have been responsible throughout history for epidemics of typhoid, cholera, and hepatitis. Standard wastewater treatment is an attempt to deal with the nutrient and bacterial problems. Basically, the flow of sewage is slowed down. This allows suspended solids to settle to the bottom, forming sludge. Advanced or secondary treatment, which many cities now have, uses microorganisms to break down much of the remaining organic matter. Bacteria are killed by adding chlorine to the effluent as it leaves the treatment plant. Unfortunately, bacteria are not the only disease-causing agents in sewage. Often viruses are also present, including the viruses that cause acute gastroenteritis and infectious hepatitis. Chlorine is generally ineffective against viruses. Shellfish, such as clams, oysters, and mussels, get their food by sucking in seawater, filtering out food particles, and releasing the water again. If the water is contaminated, pollutants will be eaten by the animals and will accumulate in their bodies. They can then be passed on to people who consume them. It's also possible to get sick simply by swallowing water at the beach. One recent study conducted for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency suggests that on urban beaches as many as 2% of all swimmers experience the diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting associated with acute gastroenteritis. One way to reduce this level of illness is to close the beaches more often, but most public health officials are reluctant to take this step.
Public health decisions in the 1980s must take into consideration social, economic, and even political factors. What we have is certainly a risk, a health risk. I think the question becomes, is the health risk significant? Is it significant enough to close off those beaches and deny our population a recreational resource? Cost-benefit, or risk-benefit, is a tool that we are using more and more in the field of public health.
If closing beaches and clam flats because of contamination with human waste presents a political problem, At least it is one informed to some extent by scientific understanding. For the most part, we know where this waste comes from and what it does. But municipal sewer systems also carry vast quantities of toxic chemicals and metals from both industries and our homes. This is the third source of concern in our sewage and the most dangerous. At best, sewage treatment concentrates some of these compounds in the sludge the process produces. It does nothing, however, to neutralize them or reduce their toxicity. Since World War II, a chemical revolution has taken place. The Registry of Chemicals of the American Chemical Society contains over 4 million entries. 6,000 new formulations are added every week. In most cases, we have little idea how these chemicals, alone or in combination, affect living things. And such ignorance can lead to serious impacts. The sad experience of the residents of Minamata, a small fishing village on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, is a poignant example. Starting in the 1930s, a major Japanese chemical company dumped mercury wastes into Yatsushiro Bay. Some of these were transformed by natural processes into a dangerous toxin, which found its way into the bay's fish and then into the townspeople who ate the fish. 20 years after the dumping began, cases were reported of what has since come to be known as Minamata disease. The disease is a form of mercury poisoning. Its victims suffer brain damage, paralysis, birth deformities, blindness, and even death. By 1976, over 120 deaths and 800 diagnosed cases of brain damage had been attributed to the disease. Many cases occurred years after people had stopped eating the fish. And once symptoms appeared, there was very little one could do. The damage had already been done. Closer to home is the less dramatic but still disturbing example of New Bedford, Massachusetts. New Bedford is a major center of the American fishing industry. Yet virtually none of the fish or lobster processed here are caught in the immediate harbor area. The reason? The flesh of the animals that live here contains dangerous levels of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Tests have shown PCBs, which remain toxic for hundreds of years, can cause liver problems, birth deformities, and cancer. These lobsters would be considered too dangerous to eat by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration if they had more than 2 parts per million of PCBs in their flesh. Yet parts of New Bedford Harbor are contaminated with 200,000 parts per million. In the 1950s and 60s, PCBs were widely acclaimed in chemical trade journals. Before being banned in 1976, they were used in a remarkable diversity of products, from electrical transformers to printer's ink. Over the years, the waters of New Bedford Harbor have received hundreds of thousands of pounds of PCB-contaminated wastes discharged by local electronics manufacturers. Now, New Bedford has the dubious honor of being one of a limited number of hazardous waste sites considered so dangerous that it is qualified for Superfund cleanup dollars. Yet whether a cleanup is even possible remains in doubt. Marine biologist Dick McGrath is part of a team of scientists studying the harbor.
The bottom line here in New Bedford is that we're not going to be able to clean up this harbor in the sense that we're going to be able to take these PCBs out of here and remove them from the environment completely. We can make the situation a lot better. Maybe that'll mean paving it over, and it's certainly an option that's been considered. Maybe it means dredging the materials out of here. We don't know yet. That's why we're doing the work. But it's at least possible that the answer is going to be that there's nothing that can be done. We don't have the technology to solve the problem. 40 years ago, when PCBs were first used here, no one knew that today we'd be standing here on the shores of this harbor talking about a crisis and a catastrophe. It's been 10 years since PCBs were outlawed for use in this country, and we still don't have the technology to clean up this type of situation. What types of chemical compounds are we making now and unknowingly releasing to the environment thinking that they're safe? only to find out perhaps 40, 50 years down the road that we've got another PCB situation on our hands and we still don't have the technology to clean it up.
Minamata and New Bedford reveal the dangers inherent in discharging the wastes of a modern industrial society. But whether all ocean dumping should therefore be banned is still a point of contention among marine scientists. Chemist Ed Goldberg sees Minamata and New Bedford as aberrations. He believes, given the depth and size of the ocean, it can safely assimilate much of society's waste.
Over the past 20 years, in the Northern Hemisphere, there has developed what I call the Cousteau mystique. The oceans are sacrosanct. We should put nothing in them. We should protect them at all possible costs. I argue even hazardous waste can be put into the oceans without an unacceptable impact if you put them far enough out.
Goldberg believes evidence of the ocean's capacity to assimilate wastes can be seen in the waters off Southern California. Here, the narrow continental shelf means deep water can be found not far offshore. Into this water, through thousands of portholes and huge underwater pipes connected to area treatment plants, the domestic and industrial waste of 11 million people is discharged into the sea.
Because of coastal waste discharge, fish develop fin rot, they develop tumors, their backbones are distorted. But the fish are not unhealthy with respect to eating, and we are not affecting, as far as we know, their reproductive successes. This is the trade-off. Is the ability of the oceans to accommodate the waste of 11 million people compensated by fish diseases of rather trivial incidents?
The school of thought Goldberg represents believes it's possible to determine how much of any contaminant we can safely discharge into the sea. With this knowledge and careful monitoring, we can minimize damage to the marine environment. But other scientists disagree. Biologist George Woodwell.
Sewage doesn't contain merely organic matter. It also contains PCBs, various insecticides, a diversity of chemicals, and heavy metals. For those substances, there is no assimilative capacity that is reasonable, and there's no way to prevent their accumulation through biotic systems to hazardous levels. But quite beyond that, the idea of putting pollutants into the oceans that one cannot under any circumstances remove if he wants to is absolutely absurd. It's just unthinkable to use the oceans in such a way as to cause an irreversible contamination that will be with us forever.
When leading scientists disagree so sharply, it's a sure sign more research needs to be done. To determine just how much risk ocean waste disposal involves, scientists need to address two fundamental problems. First, how do pollutants move once they are introduced into marine environments? And second, what impacts do individual pollutants have on both marine and human life? A tremendous number of forces influence pollutant movement. Forces like tides, prevailing winds, local currents caused by surface and bottom topography, and water depth, temperature, and salinity. For many years, the best way scientists had for studying the role these forces play was to build scale models and experiment on them. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built this replica of Chesapeake Bay in the 1970s. It's no longer used, but it remains in some ways the ultimate expression of this line of research. Covering 14 acres and holding 500,000 gallons of water, this multi-million-dollar recreation of the bay and its 100 tributaries was an essential part of a decade-long study of Chesapeake Bay. Yet even a model this large and complex leaves significant questions unanswered.
It definitely is there. Look, you've got 3.
In order to get a handle on as many variables as possible, oceanographers have turned to computers and mathematical models, which can simulate water movement and pollutant concentrations. They may be our best bet for answering some of the difficult questions that now hang over discussions of ocean waste disposal. For example, take Boston Harbor. Here, 1/2 million gallons of sludge is discharged every day on the outgoing tide. The assumption is tidal currents will take the sludge out to sea, where it will be diluted in the deeper water. But how much actually leaves the harbor? How much returns on the incoming tide? How do winds, water temperature, and local currents affect this process? These are just some of the questions MIT researchers Phil Geschwind, Eric Adams, and Rick Kosick hope to be able to answer when they complete their mathematical model of Boston Harbor. With formulas in place and existing harbor information entered, they can now make projections of pollutant movement. These projections are verified by gathering water samples from specific harbor locations and analyzing them for the presence of tracer chemicals. In this case, halogenated compounds, which are always present in the effluent discharged by the local treatment plant. Environmental chemist Phil Geschwind.
I think one of the more surprising things that we've tentatively found so far is that despite the fact that something like 1/3 of the volume of the water comes and goes with each tide, that much of that water seems to be just returning water and carries the chemicals back into the harbor with it. And what we end up seeing when we measure these halogenated compounds in the water inside the harbor is that they seem to have built up to reasonably large concentrations. They're not being flushed out as fast as we would have thought.
Yasuo Onishi and his colleagues at Pacific Northwest Laboratories are doing similar work on the West Coast and reaching similar conclusions about the ability of natural systems to flush waste. This is Squim Bay in Washington State. At its northern end, the bay connects with Puget Sound. Not far from that point, the town of Squim has its sewer outfall pipe. Using a computer model, Onishi has shown that sewage effluent from this pipe is not being as thoroughly diluted as previously believed. On the outgoing tide, local currents tend to trap the effluent near the harbor mouth. On the incoming tide, effluent flows directly into the bay. Computer models like this one may, in the not-too-distant future, dramatically improve our understanding of pollutant movement. But knowing how chemicals move is only a start. We also need to know how they affect marine species and the people who eat them, at what concentrations effects are seen, and whether these effects are immediate, long-term, or both. This is Seattle Harbor on Puget Sound. Like many other urban harbors, it has long been a dumping ground for society's waste. As a result, scientists estimate that these waters and the sediments below contain 10 to 15,000 different chemicals. For the past 10 years, a research team from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has been trying to understand how these chemicals affect the marine life of the Sound.
This one. I'm going to get the bile out of this one. That is a very small.
Over the years, biologist Donald Malins and his staff have gathered, dissected, and analyzed literally thousands of fish.
You guys, look at this.
Oh, yeah.
That is a very bad one. Yes, that's riddled with tuna.
It looks like most of the liver has been replaced by the tuna. All this in here, I would guess, not guess, I would predict that that is a hepatocellular carcinoma.
That's one of the worst ones I've seen, frankly. Isn't it?
Donald Malins.
Well, one hears talk about the assimilative capacity of our coastal waters. But when you look, as I have looked, into some of our urban bays in Puget Sound, and you find that the sediments are laced with myriad toxic chemicals, that these toxic chemicals are obviously getting into the food chain, and that you find in a number of bottom-dwelling species, such as English sole, 30% liver cancer, and perhaps 30, 40, 50% degenerative disease of the liver, you have to ask yourself, have we not reached the assimilative capacity of those urban bays? My personal opinion is clearly we have.
Malins and his staff have been able to prove statistically that toxic chemicals are responsible for cancer and other diseases in fish. Now they want to go further and determine which chemicals are to blame and how they cause disease. This is an even harder challenge. After all, it took decades to show exactly how cigarettes cause lung cancer, even though the statistical connection between the two had long been clear. On at least one front, however, the team is making real progress. For years, their fieldwork indicated a link between a group of compounds called aromatic hydrocarbons and liver tumors in certain species of fish. Aromatic hydrocarbons are found in virtually all petroleum products and are a major byproduct of the burning of fossil fuels.
You can see as we get higher.
What Malins and his staff were finding contradicted previous research that had been unable to find these hydrocarbons in fish tissue even after oil spills. Biologist Usha Varanasi took on the problem of the missing hydrocarbons.
The hydrocarbons, and so the question was whether these compounds are not taken up by the fish and therefore no problem, or whether these hydrocarbons were taken up and then released so quickly so that no accumulation was taking place. That again would be of a less of a problem, or whether these compounds were being converted as they would be in say in a rat and a human being, whether they were being converted into oxidized products that could not be identified. At that time, when the hydrocarbons were not detected in the tissues, it was believed that the fish were just not taking them up.
Varanasi believed that the hydrocarbons were being converted in the liver into new compounds that other researchers hadn't looked for. To prove this hypothesis, she injected living fish with a specific quantity of radioactively labeled benzoapyrene, a known carcinogenic hydrocarbon. Eight to 24 hours later, the liver and gallbladder were removed, and both were tested for the presence of the radioactive tracer. It was there, in the liver, and especially in the bile. Just as Varanasi suspected, the fish were metabolizing the hydrocarbons into new compounds.
In that process, the hydrocarbon, like benzopyrene, gets converted into a very reactive metabolite, which then binds to DNA and alters the DNA structure somewhat. This binding of a chemical, covalent binding of a chemical to DNA, is considered to be the initial step leading to carcinogenesis.
Dr. Varanasi made a significant contribution in helping us solve the puzzle of the causes or possible causes of some of the liver tumors which we're finding in Puget Sound. She demonstrated that aromatic hydrocarbons, particularly benzoapyrene, are metabolized to compounds which interact with DNA. But we've got to go one step further, at least in this, and we're doing that. We are exposing English sole, which developed liver cancer in Puget Sound, to extracts of sediments, which will contain the toxic chemicals, and see, in fact, whether we can induce the liver cancer in these animals under those conditions.
Donald Malins and his team of researchers are generating perhaps the most comprehensive picture of the interaction of toxics and the marine environment. Yet he readily admits it remains a very incomplete picture, and that worries him because of the seriousness of the damage that may be occurring.
Actually, these coastal environments are so complicated, and the tools which we have for measuring biological effects are so minimal, and in some cases, in my view, so primitive, that in fact we really can't measure what sort of biological effects we can expect in our marine life, particularly if these effects are long-term. And we know even less, in my view, about what the implications of all of these pollution problems are to people who consume fish from polluted environments.
If dumping waste in coastal waters has biological risks, how about going farther offshore? Ships like this one now dump New York City's sewage sludge 12 miles off the New Jersey coast. As a result of a recent court case, they'll soon take their loads 106 miles out to the edge of the continental shelf, where theoretically the ocean has a greater assimilative capacity. Here too the scientific community is divided. Marine biologist Kenneth Sherman and others believe this could lead to the pollution of vast stretches of ocean.
I think that it's clear with the stresses and perturbations that have been measured and documented for the nearshore area, that one could expect that over time a similar pattern could evolve in the so-called deep blue ocean.
Oceanographers at NOAA's Narragansett Laboratory in Rhode Island monitor the impact of open ocean waste disposal by systematically gathering seawater samples and measuring the size and quantity of the tiny animals and phytoplankton present in the sample. These life forms make up most of the ocean's biomass, and damage to them can have a ripple effect throughout the entire food chain. Unfortunately, the lab work required to do this kind of monitoring is both expensive and time-consuming. As a result, researchers rarely monitor effects beyond the immediate area of a dump site, even though the impact of dumping may be extremely widespread. There is growing acceptance among oceanographers that large areas of the ocean function as a single interdependent ecosystem. To begin to handle the enormous number of samples required to monitor these large areas of the ocean, NOAA and University of Rhode Island biologists, engineers, and electronics experts are developing an automated plankton sorting system. The computer starts with a video picture of the sample and reduces the image of each organism to its basic shape. It then searches its memory banks and identifies the shapes as fish eggs, fish larvae, or one of 13 different tiny shrimp-like creatures called copepods. In the seconds it takes to do this, the computer also takes up to 40 measurements of each organism in the sample. This technology is essential to measure changes in large marine ecosystems. Already it is being used to confirm a shift in phytoplankton size observed in heavily polluted areas.
There seems to be a tendency in a shift from large cells to small cells. If that persists over space and time, we may in fact be short-circuiting the food web. And because the small cells may dominate over the larger cells, they may preclude that nice, neat, evolved transfer of energy from one level in the food chain to the next level in the food chain. We may in fact have developed a short circuit, and that may have significant consequences. But these are the kinds of things that have not yet been fully documented. We're just now beginning to come to grips with these ecosystem level problems.
Satellites are another tool that are now being used to help scientists recognize changes occurring over such large areas.
The one thing that we cannot do from ships is obtain a synoptic, a one-time look at the entire shelf region. But one pass of a satellite will give us this information in a matter of seconds for that entire area.
But as is often the case, the more scientists learn, the more they understand how complicated some of our problems are. For example, satellites equipped to read differences in ocean temperatures have enabled oceanographers to prove the existence of warm core rings. Warm core rings are large eddies that spin off from prevailing currents and exist as self-contained mini ecosystems. With diameters of up to 200 miles, these slow-moving systems have energy comparable to 10 hurricanes. Along the Atlantic coast, warm core rings spin off from the Gulf Stream and travel south. As they do, they often cross the area of New York's deepwater dump site 106.
It's the top of the ring that's passing through the dump site.
So it'll keep that material with it as it starts rotating.
Because since the current is the ring
materials dumped into 106 that are entrained in a warm core ring could conceivably be advected to the west and reintroduced into the Gulf Stream, and perhaps in time turn up off the coast of the United Kingdom.
If we've learned anything in the last decade of pollution control, it is that there's simply no way. One relevant example is the tall smokestacks that were built in the Midwest in the early 1970s to solve local pollution problems. And now we in New England in particular are the beneficiaries of those in the form of acid rain, which is falling on our forests and our lakes. There simply is no way. The ocean cannot be the repository for wastes for all of society.
How much, if any, of society's waste the oceans can assimilate will be studied by scientists and debated for decades. In the meantime, we need to find alternatives. Unfortunately, all of our current waste disposal options pose problems. Incinerating sludge that is laced with toxic chemicals can cause air pollution. Burying it in a landfill can endanger underground drinking water supplies. Perhaps the only real solution is to keep toxic chemicals and heavy metals out of the waste stream in the first place.
The key to clean harbors, clean oceans, is pre-treatment. Pre-treating the wastes that come from American industry before it reaches the ultimate treatment plant and then into the harbor. In other words, removing the toxics at the source.
Pretreatment is an idea that applies to any industry or business that uses chemicals or metals, from the local dry cleaner to high-tech electronics firms to the metal finishing industry. This is Pioneer Metal Finishing in Franklinville, New Jersey. Like thousands of similar shops around the country, it electrically bonds surface metals like chrome and brass to steel products. Virtually everything that we encounter in our daily lives that looks metallic has been electroplated, from car bumpers to watch bands to light fixtures.
Traditionally, the plating industry is a dirty industry. We use a lot of water, we use a lot of chemicals, we use a lot of metals, and unfortunately all the metals and all the chemicals don't end up on the work. We have cadmium, nickel, copper, zinc, brass, and on down the line with whatever type of plating you're doing. And if those metals build up in your water streams in the environment and people drink them, they're going to cause very serious physical problems and possibly even death. We may have some platers that have solvents that they have to get rid of. You have very strong caustic cleaners and acids that you have to get rid of. And if any of these things go into the environment without being treated properly, then they're going to develop an imbalance in the environment. And that's going to be, hazardous to all of us.
Some years ago, Harry DeSoy decided to run the most environmentally responsible plant possible. His focus then and now is on pretreatment and recycling. Pretreatment at Pioneer involves filtering, settling, and chemically neutralizing the water they've used. After treatment, all of the water and most of the chemicals and metals are reused. Nothing is discharged into the sewer system. The process does produce a small amount of sludge, but DeSoy is looking for ways to recycle this as well. Unfortunately, Harry DeSoy is an exception. For the most part, in this and other industries, management has been reluctant to invest in expensive pretreatment equipment.
One of the great fears that you have in the plating industry is that the guy down the street isn't going to be putting out the same amount of money. I lose my competitive edge, and he ends up taking over all the business after I go by the wayside. What we've found is that we've been in it since '72 as far as waste treatment is concerned, and that hasn't happened. We've had to struggle a little bit from time to time, but now that we've learned how to do it right, we've found out it really can be done.
What DeSoy does is unusual, but for the most part, it is only what is required by existing laws.
We have laws governing our electroplating processes. We have laws that tell us that we can only discharge 1 part per million copper, or 1 part per million nickel, and on with the different metals. These laws have been in existence for a number of years. The problem is that these laws are simply not being enforced. A company can apply for extension after extension after extension, and he knows for a fact he's going to receive it. So once these laws are strictly enforced the way they should be, then we will see our industry being cleaned up.
Good morning. I'm with the district attorney's office, and we have a search warrant.
These are Los Angeles police officers. They're investigating a crime. It's not murder or rape, but they're taking it just as seriously.
The illegal dumping of toxic waste is a violent crime. It's not white-collar crime, which is the way most people think of it. When you dump toxic waste on the public, you're talking about threatening their health, indeed their very lives. The problem is that the effect is not felt immediately. If you're mugged on the street, you know right away that you've been the victim of a crime. You can feel it on the top of your head. But when you are exposed to water that has been contaminated, when you're exposed to air that has been contaminated because of toxic waste, you're not going to feel the effect right now. It may be 5, 10, or 20 years from now that you develop cancer. The effect is just as real, but it's delayed. And because it's delayed, because human nature is what it is, then the public doesn't take it as seriously as they should. Industry, God knows, doesn't take it as seriously as they should. And unfortunately, neither does law enforcement.
Because they've already had it.
Determined to enforce toxic waste laws, Reiner created the LA Toxic Waste Strike Force. Every week, representatives from a wide range of state and local agencies, from law enforcement to county health to local sanitation departments, coordinate their investigations of suspected illegal polluters.
We can always do is just run a routine inspection. We're talking about one felony disposal at one location, which we've now photographed on one specific site. So we really don't need the informant's information per se. We can send him in on an inspection, grab a sample. Based on that sample, use the aerial, get ourselves a search warrant, go in, and go ahead and file. We've got one disposal.
We bring the basic discipline of law enforcement by bringing law enforcement agencies into it, but we also bring some sophisticated scientific efforts where we use monitoring devices that we put in sewers that are able to monitor the flow of chemicals that are going by. And by cross-checking this, we can isolate the violator and know exactly what he's dumping in the sewer and when he's dumping it.
For some cases, the strike force has used remote-controlled cameras in the sewers. For others, they've flown aerial surveillance missions. The evidence they've gathered has been strong enough to win every case they've brought to court.
For the first time, we are getting jail sentences for the top corporate executives who had guilty knowledge of what was going on and didn't take any steps to put an end to it. We're talking about the chairman of the board, the president, and the vice president. When you do that, then you have a chilling effect, and that's what we're aiming for, this chilling effect upon all of the other people in industry who see what can happen if they violate the law.
In addition to serving time, a number of corporate executives have been forced to acknowledge their guilt in full-page ads like this one. Others have been required to speak at public forums.
We were wrong on what we did, and we paid the penalty.
Now, these are people who do not expect to go to jail. It's not part of their lifestyle. A common burglar, when he gets caught, he expects he's just going to have to do his time. He's going to jail. That's part of the way he does business. But corporate executives do not anticipate that. And to hear that slammer behind them and to find out that this is serious business then changes the entire equation.
In most cases, pretreatment is the only way companies can avoid breaking the law. But the idea of pretreatment goes beyond the illegal discharge of chemicals.
The concept of pretreatment is an extremely important one. It basically suggests source control. But that notion has much broader applicability. It suggests that we look at the formulation of products and say, what's going to happen when all of these products are released into the environment? Can we find substitutes for the toxic ones? Can we prevent the toxic ones from being introduced into these products? That kind of set of principles or mindset will go a long way towards the ultimate objective of a sustainable environment.
If cities like Boston, New York, and Seattle are going to clean up their harbors, pretreatment must become a priority. If and when this happens, it will also be possible for these cities to see waste not as a problem, but as a resource. Philadelphia, a city of 2.5 million people, used to take its sludge 100 miles down the Delaware River and dump it in the sea. Under persistent pressure from the EPA, the city began enforcing toxic waste discharge standards. This resulted in increased industrial pretreatment and cleaner sewage sludge. Now, not only has Philadelphia stopped dumping its sludge in the sea, it's actually selling some of it. Sludge, the thickened end product of sewage treatment, contains the nutrients which are the basis of all fertilizers. With the removal of toxic chemicals and heavy metals through pretreatment, it's possible to take advantage of these nutrients. After thickening and additional drying, sludge can be composted. This is what Philadelphia and a number of other cities are now doing. In the composting process, thickened sludge is mixed with wood chips and then laid over plastic tubing, which feeds air into the piles. Microorganisms take over from there. For the next 30 days, they help decompose the organic material in the sludge, in the process generating sufficient heat to kill off all remaining pathogens. Philadelphia's compost is screened and applied to farmland, used to reclaim strip mine sites in the western part of the state, or sold as a soil conditioner. Currently, Philadelphia's composted sludge is being marketed under the name EarthLife to landscapers, golf courses, and greenhouses.
Earth life has micronutrient benefits, it has secondary elements, it has NPK, the macronutrients, it has water-holding characteristics equal to peat moss, and it makes plants grow deeper and greener because of some of the iron content in it. What we do is we bring the material in and say, Mr. Grower, Mr. Landscaper, Mr. Golf Course Superintendent, try it and just stand back, and we wait, and he uses it, and he usually calls us because the product proves itself. A salesman doesn't prove the viability of a product. The product proves it to the customer who's buying it. And it's a great product. Compost is a great product.
San Diego also sees its sewage as a potential resource. But here it could be a future source of water. San Diego grew up in a virtual desert. It depends on water imported at great expense from other parts of the country. Yet every day its treatment plants dump into the sea 180 million gallons of what could be usable water.
This is a reverse osmosis unit. Now, if you remember, I was talking about a semi-permeable membrane.
Advanced technology to turn wastewater into drinking water exists, but is terribly expensive. In order to afford it, San Diego is looking for ways to save money on its current sewage treatment system. Someday, the water hyacinth may help San Diego use the water it now throws away. Early experiments with this remarkable plant suggest the city may be able to cut some sewage treatment costs in half.
The water hyacinth plant is a rather unique aquatic plant. Floats on the surface of the water, but its very hairy roots, its fibrous roots, hang down in the water and become the perfect filter for filtering out the organic material in the wastewater. These hairy roots also provide a home for literally millions and millions of organisms that assist in the treatment process. Bacteria, crustaceans, snails, all live in these root systems and perform part of the treatment process.
Aquaculture is not a process that will work for every community. It needs a warm climate and a system that has already dealt with toxic wastes. But it does represent the kind of creative thinking that is needed everywhere if our society is not to be overwhelmed by our own wastes.
In the 1970s, this nation made a commitment to protect its coastal oceans. However, with the increasing population and the increasing generation of waste, that commitment that was made in the 1970s is now being called into question. It's called into question because the oceans still represent a very cheap alternative to dispose of waste. That alternative is becoming increasingly attractive as people say, we've got to protect our groundwater, we've got to protect our landscapes. Therefore, we only have one recourse, and that recourse is to dump our waste in the oceans. That tension is creating the opportunity, looking at this from the optimistic side, to begin to change the way we think about material and waste. Instead of saying we acquire material, we use it, and we throw it away, we begin to shift to a different kind of orientation, and that orientation is we use material, we then recycle it, or we confine and protect it from being released into the environment. We're nowhere near moving through that transition, and whether we will do it and do it satisfactorily is still very much in doubt.
We cannot retreat from zealously guarding our oceans just because there are other environmental problems, and admittedly severe ones, such as groundwater contamination. We need to deal with both marine protection and groundwater protection at the same time. And what that means is that we, as a society, are going to have to undergo dramatic changes.
One of the measures of how strongly ingrained in our society is this pattern of getting a material, using that material, and whether it be a chemical or whether it be some kind of a product, and we've finished with it, it's no longer of value to us, we simply send it out in the environment. We throw it away. We dump it in a river, we dump it in the ocean, we dump it on the land somewhere. One measure of how deeply ingrained that is we keep asking questions, well, where should we put it? That's the wrong question. If we ask where we should put it, we're going to have to find a place to put it. The question we should be asking is, how do we avoid generating it in the first place? If we can begin to ask that question, then turn loose the scientific and engineering capacity of this and other nations, we can have the benefits of these kinds of materials and yet avoid degrading the environment as a function of their use.
For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Nova, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Please be sure to include the show title. To purchase film or video copies of this program for educational use, call toll-free 1-800-621-2131. In Illinois or Alaska, call Collect, 312-940-1260. This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. And by Allied Signal, a technology leader in aerospace, electronics, automotive products, and engineered materials. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying health care products worldwide.